All right. I know we have some people joining us from Canada, so they were very curious about exactly where you were living in Saskatchewan. Okay. All right.
This is my third day here. My second full day, so it's a bit chaotic. Yeah.
All right. So I think we'll start now. People are still joining, but to be respectful of our time, we will begin. So hello and welcome to our series on confronting racism, discrimination, and othering perspectives from around the world. For those of you who are returning, we're happy to see you again. And for all of you who are here for the first time, welcome. I am Dr. Maria Nardone, Director of Technology and Global Learning at the William Alanson White Institute of Psychiatry, Psychoanalysis, and Psychology. Before I introduce our guest speakers today, I would like to thank members of the Institute's administration for their support in creating our series. Kenneth Isold, Elizabeth Krimendahl, Richard Herman, John Aumann, and Elizabeth Rodman. I would also like to acknowledge the work of the members of my committee. They have created our program, invited speakers, and are the moderators for our events. My committee includes Karen Gennaro, Anton Hart, Tom Hennis, Gurmeet Kanwal, Catherine Nordze, Vladan Novakovic, Jean Petroselli, Hopton Shaw, David Solomon, Masato Sujikawa, and Cleone White. To all of you, thank you. I would like to extend a special welcome to our participants from around the globe. We have members joining us today from Canada, Australia, Portugal, Russia, Mexico, Greece, Japan, Germany, the UK, India, Taiwan, Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, Israel, Iran, Vietnam, Romania, and of course, the United States. I would also like to thank everyone who submitted questions for our speaker in advance today. We will try to get to as many of them as possible. During our talk today, you can also submit questions or comments in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Someone has asked, yes, this is a webinar, so our participants are not seen or heard with the audio, but you can put your comments in the question and answer button. So we're very honored and really privileged to have Michelle Good with us today. Michelle Good is a Cree writer and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. After working for Indigenous organizations for 25 years, she obtained a law degree and advocated for residential school survivors for over 14 years. Michelle Good earned a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia while still practicing law and managing her own law firm. Her poems, short stories, and essays have been published in magazines and anthologies across Canada, and her poetry was included on 2 lists of the best Canadian poetry in 2016 and 2017. Five Little Indians, her first novel, won the HarperCollins UBC Best New Fiction Prize, the Amazon First Novel Award, the Governor General's Literary Award, and the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Award. It was also longlisted for Scotiabank Giller Prize and a finalist for the Writers' Trust Award. Michelle Good now lives and writes in southern interior of British Columbia. She is currently working on her second novel. Our moderator today is Tom Hennis. He's founder of Think Design, an internationally recognized award-winning exhibition design firm that has presented dynamic visitor experiences at museums and cultural attractions in numerous settings throughout the world. Believing in the implicit power of the exhibition medium to engage society in important ways, he has pursued an ever-deepening involvement with exhibition projects embedded in social and environmental justice. At Think, He has encouraged an evolving conception of relational design, envisioning the exhibition as a narrative environment rich in implicit and explicit confluences, contradictions, and paradox. Mr. Hennis has written extensively on the multifaceted role of museums and has taught at leading academic and design institutions, including the Rhode Island School of Design, the Pratt Institute in Bois-Boucher, France, New York University's Interactive Communications Program, and the University of Pretoria, among many others. So without any more from me, I would like to turn the program over to Michelle and Tom. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maria. And Michelle, a heartfelt welcome. I'm very, very grateful that you agreed to come talk to us today, and really excited about spending some time with you.
Well, I was really excited to receive the invitation. This is it's just right up my alley, the things that I think about, the things so I'm really pleased to be here.
I'm wondering, because so much of your work is focused over the last few decades around the residential schools in Canada, I'm just wondering if we could start out with your just giving the audience some background on those schools and what their history and sort of your perspective on what they've done.
Sure. Basically, it was a government-sanctioned program since about the, I guess I would say, the middle of the 1800s, where the governments participated with the church, the unholy alliance of church and state, to implement some colonial agendas designed at terminating Indigenous populations. And I don't mince words about that anymore. I used to think that the whole objective of these residential schools was assimilation, but I've since changed my mind. But I'm going to just go back a little bit and give a little bit of history about this. I guess, about the end of the first third, I guess, of the 1800s, a colonial government consultant was sent to the US to visit the Carlisle School. The residential schools are not unique to Canada. They actually were established in America before they were started in Canada. And the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania was this model school of what an Indian residential school should look like. They just called them Indian schools in the US. And that's a term that the inmates of residential schools in Canada use to refer to it. Still, in my dealings with survivors at Indian school. And so this fellow, Henry Flood Davin, who is well known in Canadian history, was sent to the Carlisle School to assess whether or not these industrial type schools would be suitable for Canada. And he came back and enthusiastically reported that yes, indeed, this would be an excellent tool for the colonial agenda that was behind these schools in the first place. I refer to the residential schools as a key implement in the colonial toolkit. Their objective, unabashedly and clearly stated, was to kill the Indian in the child. And one of our fearless, he was at the time the superintendent of Indian Affairs, but he became the Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, who at the time he said, I can't give you a direct quote, but I can tell you the gist of it, that the schools must be away from the reserves, must be away from the villages, because they're savages. And if they continue to be near their parents, they may learn to read and write, but they'll just still be savages that learn to read and that can read and write. And so this mandate, if you will, to remove children was was established very early on in the process to take them away from their families, to place them under, I guess, the intense or in an intense environment that did not actively work against them maintaining any of their cultural integrity, their language, anything that forms their cultural identity. And so for 130 years, there were basically no school-age children in any Indigenous community in Canada, because it became the law. It was entrenched that attendance at these schools were mandatory, and parents could be fined or incarcerated if they tried to prevent their children from going to these schools. But even prior to that time, without the involvement of the state, in Eastern Canada, the churches were already involved in apprehending children and taking it upon themselves to inculcate them in Catholicism primarily, and to, as one bishop once stated, to humiliate them, to humiliate these children when they think about their Native identity, and stated once they were done, there would be nothing Native about them except their blood. So the stated objective, it was always very clear, was never suggested that this was some kind of, benevolent desire to educate and to support Indigenous people as equal partners that they in fact were. It was to destroy the fabric of Indigenous communities, and to, in effect, undertake a genocidal act. And if you look to the genocide conventions, which is what I do, there are 5 definitions of genocide that arose after the Second World War, that were when the genocide conventions were developed. And the fifth of those, the fifth definition, is the removal of children from one group to another, or the transfer of children from one group to another. So this was a genocidal initiative, and it has rippled through, the trauma of it has rippled through Indigenous communities, and continues to, since the first school was opened, and it will for a long time now. So in a nutshell.
One of the things that's so striking to me about what you describe, and the experiences that I've had in speaking to others about schools, is that the public face of them was so different, that we have a society that so readily purports a myth about itself, while undertaking, in a sense, simultaneously in full view, an atrocity against a whole community, a whole group of nations nestled within it. That kind of disparity. I'm just wondering how much of that you run into, of sort of people thinking, but this was perfectly fine. This was benevolent. We would never do anything like this.
It is the underlying theme, right? It's actually quite astonishing how something so dreadful could be going on, and the dominant society, if you will, is living with this myth that a great kindness and a great benevolence is being done. And it actually, I run into that a lot with readers who have read my book, and they reach out to me, which I of course enjoy, and they'll say things like, "I just had no idea. I just had no idea." One of them that sticks in my mind was, "I just never knew, but now I'll never forget." And I think, this was part of the agenda. These were total institutions. And for those who don't know what a total institution is that there's no external oversight, that these schools were operated, and basically the church participants were given carte blanche to run these schools the way they wanted to, and they were paid by the federal government to operate these schools with these mandates, right? No, they cannot speak their Indigenous languages. They cannot pray in their Indigenous way. They cannot, basically do anything Indigenous. They cannot, the gender separations, right, where everything was boys' side, girls' side. Even if you had a brother there, you're a young woman and you have a brother there, you couldn't communicate with your brother because girls were not allowed to speak with boys. And it was just this very carefully designed process for destroying the fabric of Indigenous community. But the other thing that's quite interesting about this is that these institutions, I try not to call them schools anymore because there was nothing educational about them. These institutions were often in remote locations. They were rarely anywhere near non-Indigenous communities. They were, for example, I think of Cooper Island, which was off on a little island, near Vancouver Island, and anything could happen because nobody was watching, and everything did happen. The incidents of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and now, with the initiative of some Indigenous communities, the identification of the skeletal remains of missing children and children that were made at home. And, it's very interesting because there's this huge sort of hue and cry, or there has been, about, this shock about the fact that so many children died in the residential schools. And, but these things were known. These things were known as early as 1907, when the chief medical officer of the Department of Indian Affairs was commissioned to do a study of the conditions in the residential school because the families were so deeply concerned about illness and children dying and so on. He came back and reported to his superior, Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time. And he said, if we had set out to create institutions that would promote the transference of tuberculosis, we've done it with the residential schools. He said, even in war, it is rare to see this number of fatalities, the number of children dying. And Duncan Campbell Scott responded by saying, while it's true that the children die more readily than they do in their villages, that in itself is not enough for us to change our direction, which is to, and we will continue until there is not one Indian that has not been absorbed into the body politic. And he later wrote that, Duncan Campbell Scott, that it was too bad that so many of these children didn't get to benefit, quote unquote, from the residential school process, because in many cases, up to 50% of the kids in the schools were dying. And, so the notion that this was some kind of benevolent effort to assimilate Indigenous people, to assist them in adapting to, a changing lifestyle, is just simply absurd. It was an act of genocide. It was an act of termination, and we're still suffering. We're still trying to cope with these things.
You're describing a situation in which the dominant culture, the people of the dominant culture, the human beings who run the joint, exhibit, in essence, a complete loss of any human connection, a loss of imagination, that the people they're incarcerating, the people they are pushing into the mainstream, quote unquote, however they would phrase it. But there's an utter, complete loss of recognition of humanity in this. And as I'm listening to you, even though I've heard so many of these stories in the course of our work, I'm still recoiling anew and feeling a kind of flood of horror, both at what these generations of children and their families and their communities experienced, and also at the kind of depravity that lives within the colonial psyche, that enables such a thing to, not only enables, but creates the conditions for such a thing to happen.
Well, and
Yeah.
that is the point, right? That is the point. And that the beast underneath this is colonialism. Oops, I'll go back. Am I back yet? Tell me when I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me, Tom?
Yep, you're back.
Okay. I'll warn everybody, I get wobbly internet sometimes, but I always come back. But as I was saying, the beast underneath all of this is colonialism, because what drives colonialism is, in effect, capitalism, right? And capitalism, at the root of the capitalist ideology, is the necessity to exploit, and it just continues and continues and continues and continues. And so, you know, there's a wonderful book, and I recommend it constantly. It's called Clearing the Plains by a fellow named James Dashik. It began as his doctoral thesis or his dissertation, and it's published, and it is one of the most brilliant histories that I've ever read about that time in colonial history in the plains, the Great Plains, what was Northwest Territories, but is now Saskatchewan, Alberta, you know, parts of Montana, Dakota, and so on, that landmass at the time. And he articulates the absolutely cold-blooded dictates of the colonial government in terms of how to deal with Indigenous peoples. And you know, again, the Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, he issued an edict in the sort of mid 1800s, which is when the Métis were engaging in resistance, but also the Cree, my people, were refusing to enter into treaty unless they could have, you know, favorable terms. So some of those edicts were to kill all the buffalo. Okay, Regina, which is the capital city of Saskatchewan, the name of Regina used to be Pile of Bones. Okay, and there's this wonderful picture, and if anybody wants to Google Pile of Bones, you'll see it. It's a photograph of a buffalo hunter, if you will, and he looks about this big, and the pile of bones is about this big. And the edict was kill the buffalo, because the buffalo, as go the buffalo, go the Cree, go the Indigenous people of the prairies. And because the buffalo and the bison were food, clothing, and shelter, they were everything. And so there would be trains that would be going through the prairies, and they would just be shooting buffalo off the trains, leaving them to rot and die, because they were being, you know, it was part of the whole thing to starve us out, so that we had no alternative but to enter into treaty, because associated with treaty was rations, okay, that they would feed starving people if they would sign the treaties, which of course is legally the very definition of duress, right? So, and you know, and so, you know, there were edicts when they were intensely in these negotiations. Sir John A. Macdonald instructed a particular Indian agent, well, more than one, but in the example that I'm using, because it involves one of my direct relations, he instructed them to withhold rations for weeks. Weeks and weeks, there would be rations rotting in storehouses, and they would not be given to these people because they refused to enter into terms that they understood were not beneficial to them. And so at one point, and I'll refer to the Frog Lake incident, in Canadian history, they refer to it as the Frog Lake Massacre, but I won't use that term, where this sexually abusive Indian agent who used to take young girls until he was tired of them, and then he'd get another one, always Indigenous girls, of course, was laughing at the war chief, the war chief of Chief Big Bear's band, Mistahi Masqua, when he was advocating to try and get food for the people. And so he killed him. And I sort of like that. But it was these policies of, these starving people that created this conflict. It would have never happened. That violent insurrection would have never happened if it had not been for that colonial drive to control the resources. And that's what James Dashik's book, Clearing the Plains, really gets into, is that all of this was about, when they say clearing the plains, it means getting us off the plains so that it could be open to settlers, so that the resources could be exploited for the benefit of the colonial government, the colonial settlement for Canada or North America, really. So, and so that when you think about that, okay, that they're prepared to starve people, that they're like literally sitting at their desks in Ottawa saying, don't give those kids food. Right? Don't give these people food, even though we've killed off all of their resources. If you think of it in that sense, then you can almost get into that mindset where it was okay in the colonial mind, if there is such a thing, in the colonial psyche, it was okay to walk into Indigenous communities and just take all the kids, just take them all. And what is so important to understand, I believe, is that, aside from, and just all you need to do is scratch the surface of reading material that's out there now, and you will come to understand that this was not a benevolent program, that this was a part of colonial war, if you will. And so you can find that. James's book is a good place to start. So is mine. But the other thing that I don't think people really understand is that we did not just experience residential schools as individuals. We experienced it collectively as a people. And this is such an important point, because there's been so much focus lately on the fact of the children being taken away and the abuses that children suffered and the lack of education and lack of support when they were unceremoniously dumped at 16 because the payment for them stopped. But you have to think about the impact of these schools on the integrity of the Indigenous community at large. When those children were taken, and you have to visualize this, communities right across North America devoid of all school-age children, okay? So who's left? The mums, the dads, the grandparents, the aunties, the uncles. And what has been taken from them is not only their children, which is horrific enough as it is, but their role has been taken, because their role in the traditional context was to raise up those children and to help them find their place in the Indigenous community and what their role is in that cultural dynamic, in that cultural milieu. So their role as teachers, as doctors, as all of the various roles that people had in Indigenous communities are just gone. They're gone. And at the same time, the children are gone, and the children have lost their teachers, and so the impact of it is that the very fabric, the role of those grandparents and parents was to pass down the traditional knowledge, to pass down the history of the people, to raise up these children in what their role would be, what their important role would be in the continuation of Indigenous knowledge and culture. all of that was taken away by the act of removing all of these children. And it created just, I hate to say it, but it feels like an irreparable tear in the fabric of Indigenous communities and cultures right across the continent.
What you're describing is a kind of devastating shattering of all of the relational links
Exactly.
among and within generations.
Yes.
And it's something that most of us can scarcely imagine. And, it kind of takes me to the book in a way, because your book, which I will unabashedly plug, fabulous book. Everybody get it. 5 Little Indians, Michelle Good. Buy it now while it lasts, or maybe buy it so it has to be reprinted. But you've created 5 almost indelible characters, and then a group of supporting characters around them who are alive and vivid, and each very distinct in their experiences and in their personalities, and very distinct in the way their lives evolve. And I'd love to have you read something from it, maybe just talk for a moment about how, I'm sure you talked many times about how you came to write the book, but I'm more interested in how the characters themselves came to you, how they entered your life.
Sure, I'm really happy to talk about that, because these characters, it took me 9 years to write this book, and lots of other stuff going on, but it took 9 years. And these characters became like my children. I still feel bonded to them like my children. But what I did when I mean, this is my first novel. I didn't know how to write a book, so I just did what I had to do. But the first character that I wrote about was, I wrote 1 paragraph as a writing exercise, and it was about Kenny. He's one of the 5. And I understood immediately, as soon as I wrote that I needed more. That one character could not carry, I guess, the full spectrum of the harm that was done to children in these schools. And so what I did was, I read, during the course of my legal career, when I was advocating for survivors, I read literally hundreds of psychological and psychiatric assessments. And also, like, not just when I was advocating, but just generally in my legal career, and psychological assessments of traumatized children. And so what I did was I just created, 5 was an arbitrary number, and I just created 5 characters by, I would look at the kinds of harms that a child would experience, like the type of abuses, whether it was physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, all of those things that occurred in these schools. And I assigned those kinds of abuses to each character. And then I looked at, okay, so what is the psychological injury that this child would experience as a result of those abuses? And then what, with that psychological injury, what is the likely trajectory of that person's life? And so that was basically how I developed these characters. And so not intentionally, but I guess kind of intentionally, each character became like an archetype of a survivor, of the different realities of survivors of residential schools. And so in those characters, you see the realities that we continue to live with as a result. And those are, the over-incarceration of Indigenous people, suicide rates that are through the roof, 7 times the national average is, for Indigenous people, addictions, other basic other psychological injuries like post-traumatic stress disorder, OCD, these kinds of things. So basically, I gave these archetypes realities and conditions that would express what it was like for these kids to experience this and then to just be tossed back into the world, carrying tremendous burden of psychological injury with no support, with no ability to really go home, which will lead me to this reading I'm going to do, and just basically injured so deeply and likely to never have the benefit of a therapeutic intervention, and to just have to find a way carrying all of that kind of stuff. So with that, I'm going to read, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. And I want to ask you about Mariah and Kenny's mom as well. These two very powerful maternal figures who have very, very different worlds.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll start. I don't know, for those of you who, I try not to give spoilers, thinking about when people might read the book or haven't read the book, but this little short reading is about one of the characters, Maisie, and Maisie is a very she breaks my heart. But this is about her reminiscing when she tried to go home after being released from the residential school, and it should give you a flavor of that complex reality of trying to go home when you really can't go home again. So in the Tom Wolfe sense of things, right? So anyway, okay. When they let me out of the mission school, Sister traveled with me all the way to Vancouver and put me on a boat that was supposed to take me home. There were 7 of us girls from the mission school and another 12 boys and girls from other Indian schools who joined up with us to catch the boat and head back up north to our coastal village. 10 years had passed since they dragged me away from my mom, kicking and screaming, and it was the last time I'd seen her or my dad. When we got to our village, tired, cold, and hungry, we were herded off the boat in single file. Standing on the beach at the end of the dock were a group of men and women milling around and looking to the dock as we walked towards them. For a moment, the two groups just stood there, kids on the dock, parents on the sand. Then a boy from one of the other schools broke and ran, calling out for his dad. The rest of us ran too, right into that crowd of grown-ups who were supposed to be our parents. We were all pretty much as tall as them now, and everyone was looking at everyone else, looking for something familiar, something to recognize. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, hoping one of them was my mum and that she would recognize me. I couldn't pick her out in the crowd. A woman approached me, gently asking if I was Sally. No, not me. Finally, I noticed a woman, her hair wrapped tight in a pale blue scarf, standing at the edge of the group, looking straight at me. I knew it was my mum. Arms open, she ran for me, crying. My mum took me home and gave me tasty things to eat. My dad was out fishing, she said, but would be back in the morning. She said they weren't really sure I would be there that day. The house was smaller than in my memory, but familiar. And the whole evening, I just wanted to cry as I took it all in. The place I'd been dreaming of for 10 years. My dad came home the next morning and held me so tight. He smelled of wood smoke and fish, and that primal smell tumbled me back in time to a thin memory of me and my mum meeting him at the dock. Meeting me at the dock, him tossing me in the air, me laughing so hard my belly hurt. He would carry me home like I weighed nothing, my face in the crook of his neck, rough sea salt rubbing off on my face. They told me that after I was taken, no one told them where I was. They still didn't know which school I'd been sent to. I couldn't help but wonder if they tried to find out. They must have, but the angry question kept rising in me anyway, and their constant affection began to disgust me. I lasted a month. no matter how hard I tried, this place, their house, was no longer home. And these people, oh thank goodness. And these people, though kind and loving, were like strangers pretending to be family. I hitched a ride on a trawler to Prince Rupert and took a bus to Vancouver with the $100 my dad pressed into my hand as my mother stood by crying. Not so long ago, I was at the Balmoral. I met a girl from up there. After the expected ritual sharing of who your aunties and uncles are, she told me she was sorry about my mum. I didn't know, but she didn't need to say more. I had so many dreams at the Indian school about going home to her, dreams about sleeping safe in my own room, playing on the beach at ease and without fear, and cooking with her. What I so desperately needed was to be standing on that stool by the stove, carefully stirring under her watchful eye, like when I was little. To be little again, living without fear and brutality. No one gets that back. All that's left is a craving, insatiable, empty place.
Oh, thank you for that.
Oh, I'm sorry to get emotional. But,
Be not sorry.
It just, because it's, I worked with so many people that was their experience, and so it's very real to me. And sometimes I'm able to be professional, and sometimes it just breaks my heart. So, but anyway,
yeah, I definitely want to get to these two women, but what you're experiencing and what I'm feeling right now is the immense void between that personal experience of this life amid these broken links, and this simultaneous blindness, willful blindness, which I've also experienced working with the potential museum at Sing Sing prison. The walls are there not just to keep the people in, but so that those outside don't have to be aware of the things we have anxiety about. We build those walls so we can't see inside. And in many ways, I think there's so much that's in the book and so much in the story behind the book that is about this barrier that is willfully, statutorily maintained between that internal experience that is also a community experience, and the internal reality of the outside community that has been trained for generations not to see it.
That's right. The willful blindness of it is just so horrifying. And, but I have tried to be not judgmental, because I feel that, and that was why I chose fiction, ultimately. I could have written, a very complex historical tome about residential schools, but I chose fiction because really I wanted people to feel it. I wanted people to feel what this is really all about. And also I chose to focus on life after residential school, because there's actually quite a lot of work in the academy and in individual memoir and so on about the experiences at the school, but there was very little about what happened after, when the kids were unceremoniously dumped at 16, because at 16, that's when the government stopped paying for their care, loosely used, but stopped paying for their food, clothing, shelter. And so off they were gone. And, and so these descriptions of these kids sort of arriving in the city, Lucy in particular. And when we talk about these isolated residential schools. The school that I modeled this school off could only be reached by boat. So these little wee kids would show up at 3, sometimes as young as 3 years old, but generally at 5 or 6. And they would never leave the island, so to speak, for 10 years. And then they're just dumped in an urban setting. And, you know, and what they're being dumped into, it's bad, not, you know, as if it weren't bad enough that they've just been raped, beaten, had needles stuck in their tongue if they spoke their Indigenous language, and that is true. They've just been through this horrifying experience, and now they're tossed into an urban center or even a smaller center where they are surrounded by people who have who drank the Kool-Aid in terms of Indigenous people being savages, being ignorant, being backward, being stupid, being all of the negative stereotypes that are associated with Indigenous people. And there just had not been enough work done on the impacts. And those impacts are something that I personally worked with for 14 years. The 14 years that I advocated for survivors. And it just has to be said out loud, you know, that the brutality of this, and that brutality is the impacts of it. And I try to, and Tom and I, we spoke about this before, to distill things down to their most basic form, if you will, and you know, to try to make things more easily understood generally. And the way that I am referring to trauma these days is that it's like radioactivity. It has a half-life, and it continues, it continues, it continues. And the intergenerational harm of these schools goes both ways, right? As I was describing with the parents and the older generation, that generation was traumatized by the experience of having their children taken away. The children were traumatized by the experience of being taken away into this abusive thing. And the impacts of that continue and will continue to ripple through our communities, you know, in the form of addiction, suicide, violence, all of the things that you see, you know, until we are in a position where we can be self-determining and self-sufficient. And that requires a political will that still doesn't exist anywhere. And yeah, so
this resonates so powerfully. I actually, it's a great segue to talk about Mariah. And sorry, I get choked up thinking of her. But maybe you could. This is a character for those who haven't read the book. Who, Michelle, why don't you talk about her?
So Mariah is what you would call in the literary world a secondary character, but she's probably one of the most important characters in the book. She's an Indigenous healer whose parents and grandparents made sure she didn't have to go. They hid her, and she lived in the Cypress Hills, which is where I am now, and she just became a healer. She just lived out in the bush and became a healer. And you know, she had her sweat lodge and she had her ways, and it was very interesting. Once I did a presentation to a group of psychotherapists, and one of them responded to Mariah by saying, "It's like she's a therapist, but without training." I said, "No, she's a therapist with millennia of training behind her in the traditions and ceremonial protocols of our people." So Mariah played a critical role in the novel of providing a safe place and providing gentle therapy to mad Clara, angry Clara, and helped her. Clara was a little kid who had a spiritual awakening when she was about 5-6 years old, and then lost it in the residential school out of rage at what happened to her little friend in the residential school. And she lived out that rage by getting involved with the American Indian movement and sort of the more radical aspects of the what we used to call in the 70s the Indian movement. And she ends up getting injured as a result of that, and through that finds her way, through her friends, finds her way to Mariah, who then helps her get rid of Sister Mary's voice in her head, because Sister Mary's voice in her head is saying devil worship about the sweat lodge, devil worship, and it helps her, I guess, exercise Catholicism and the brutality of it, and to find healing in her own cultural traditions.
One of the things that you mentioned a few minutes ago was just a kind of my words, not your, but waves of sometimes questioning whether this can ever end, whether this can ever be repaired, and that's the road to repair, and that's the wrong term. There are many paths, obviously, but maybe you can talk a little about the role of resistance, the role of healing, reaching into those thousands of years of tradition, and what you've been able to observe of that.
Well,
experience.
What's really interesting, and I'm not, maybe I'm sort of going off on my own tangent on that, but I'm gonna anyway. What's really interesting is that, and I'm old enough now, I just turned 65 day before yesterday, and I started working with Indigenous organizations when I was 18. So I've been involved in this basically my whole life. And I can see now, I've been around, I'm old enough now, I can see that there has been change, there has been improvement. It's not enough, but it has happened. But the curious thing is that it's been Indigenous people who have created the change and who have insisted it's been us that has led the charge in terms of establishment, recognition of rights, in terms of even I'll just tell you an anecdote, and I think it helps to illustrate this. When the litigation first started in Canada with respect to residential schools, it started with a small group of people, survivors, that were trying to cope with the trauma that they were experiencing as a result of the residential schools. And they went to Indian Affairs and they asked Indian Affairs, the Department of Indian Affairs, I guess it's the bureau in the US, and they asked them for just something like $25,000, right, to support a healing group. And so the Department of Indian Affairs got a legal opinion from the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice said, "Don't do it. It could be perceived as an admission of liability," and so they denied the funding request, and so they filed a lawsuit for the harms arising from their treatment at residential school. And that ended up in the largest class action in Canadian history in terms of resolving these cases. So now I think I've lost my track about why I wanted to go there. It's very early here, everybody, forgive me. Oh, yes, but that's my point, is that it's always been on our shoulders. The education of non-Indigenous people has been on our shoulders. And, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's the 96 calls to action that were part of that, of the report. And recently, people may be aware of the Tk'emlúps Indian band discovering the 215 skeletal remains on the grounds of the residential school. Well, in 2015, when the Truth and Reconciliation report came out, there are 5 calls to action, 71 through 76, that come under the heading of missing children and burial sites. And basically, the commission gave the federal government a roadmap for how to deal with this terrible issue of kids that never made it home and kids that they don't know where they are or what happened to them. And they asked for $1.5 million to begin this process. And the federal government, under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, a conservative then, just said no, typically. And so what happens then is that the Indigenous community takes it upon themselves. We had to take it upon ourselves to go to find the resources to be able to look for these bodies. And it was only when we produced the evidence, we produced the skeletal remains, that the entire country was sort of in this hue and cry of, oh my God, what? Dead kids? And the reality is that this was known when we go back to where I started talking. This was known in 1907 that up to 50% of the kids were dying in the schools. Okay, but because of that deep conditioning of don't look, okay, with this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. We are educating the poor savage. Okay. And that became the, it became part of the fabric of Canadian society so that it would be rote. And I'll give you an example. I taught a third-year history course at UBC. It was called History of Native People in Canada. I changed Native, and they gave me a year. I said, a year? You want me to tell this history in a year? But I started, because it was, of course, all non-Indigenous students. And I started with a question. I said, I want you to tell me everything you know about Indigenous people. And everybody got completely uncomfortable. And I said, it's just try. I have a slowly started all this.
You've gone all wobbly on us.
Okay. You'll tell me when I'm back.
You're back.
You'll tell when I'm back.
You're back.
Okay. So, all these stereotypes about, they have people have a propensity to addiction, Indian people get free houses, get education, all of the stereotypes, just every stereotype.
Well, there you go. You're back.
Okay. Wow. Anyway, so I wrote them all down. And then once the conversation slowed down and, stopped, I said, okay, I have another question for you. And that question is, how do you know that? How do you know these things? And that room was an absolute, they were in a stunned silence. Not a single one of them could say how they came to know that as absolute truth. And I said, okay, so that's the focus of our course. We're gonna find out how you came to know that, and we're gonna talk about what is really true. And so, this, it really was an institutionalized oral tradition, if you will. Indigenous people are not the only people that have an oral tradition. So we go back to that era of clearing the plains again, and you imagine the fathers of Confederation, okay, who were perpetrating these crimes, okay, and what their children were learning at the knee of these people, and their children, their children, their children. I wrote an essay called The Tradition of Violence that goes into this. And were these people monsters? No. They were just people of their time, like that were receiving this colonial agenda, incorporating it into their national identity, and forever after, we are drunks, lazy, right? and that's the world that these kids are going into, right? They're so injured, if they're not dead, and going into this world where there's this solid wall of misconception, of racism, of hatred, of this colonial urge to destroy that has been basically bred into generations of North Americans. And so, yeah. There's so many things that we could talk about this this terrible legacy that, you know, we could just go on for days, I fear.
Yes, I think you're right about that. One of the things I just want to reiterate, and you touched on this earlier, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was at least in my reading, well, let's just say a half measure. It was extrajudicial. It was discretionary. It was not meant to personalize any facts. It was meant to create a narrative. And we could spend an hour on that. And the stories of the exhumations at the residential schools that have so far been exhumed lets us down south say, oh, those Canadians, we thought they were so civilized. The U.S. is the model for this, and you brought that up at the beginning. It started here. We have had no Truth and Reconciliation Commission, however flawed. And this is the history about which almost nothing is ever spoken in the States. So however flawed this state of affairs are in Canada, in many ways, there's a more pervasive blindness here.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. We have senators that are sitting in, the Canadian Senate. Well, they're not. One of them is not anymore. Who unabashedly insisted on saying these were well-intentioned schools. So, and it's kind of a myth that rolls around that the Canadians were so much nicer to their Indians. Right. And we weren't, right? We absolutely were not. There were more, I guess, incidences of war and, physical termination, the murdering, the massacres, that occurred more in the US than it did in Canada, but it did happen in Canada as well. It's just so hidden from history. Because of the will of this country, that it's part of the Kool-Aid. It's part of the Kool-Aid. We were so much nicer to Indigenous people, but we were not, in fact. And but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that work again emerged from the litigation that I referred to, either when this class action first started. And the only reason I believe fully that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established was it was a carrot. Okay, these claims were settled. Just to give you an example, okay, the maximum that a person could be compensated through this program for gross, ongoing, sustained, major sexual assault was about $225,000. There was one case of a non-Indigenous woman who was, she was sexually assaulted, but it wasn't over years. It was a couple of incidents, and I don't mean to minimize it at all, but I'm just offering that for comparison. She was compensated to the tune of $800,000. And so these little add-ons to the settlement litigation were about keeping the money, keeping the settlement amounts low. Okay, well, the maximum is going to be this, but we're going to give you the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we're going to give you the Racism Museum, the Museum of, Human Rights, which is, one of the most racist institutions in the land. And, we're going to give you the Healing Foundation. We're going to fund the Healing Foundation. Well, they funded it for 3 years, period. That's not, I mean, it's all superficial. All of it is superficial. And by settling these claims on an individual basis, and they've denied the collective harm, the collective impact. And one of the issues that came up in the litigation was cultural loss and the impact of cultural loss. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, where Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin said it's not recognizable at law, cultural loss. The same Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, who some years later, when she was no longer on the bench, described residential schools as cultural genocide. Because, she didn't, she was no longer rendering a decision, she was rendering an opinion. And, and that would have just been too much of a strain on the beautiful Canada to have a finding of genocide. So, yeah. So it looks a little better, but it isn't.
Yeah, I guess the point I was making was not Canada's better, but that we have no grounds for feeling smug down here.
True.
And the point you make about the Human Rights Museum, I have 2 Indigenous colleagues who quit from there because they felt it was so racist they couldn't continue there. And then a colleague who also quit the Royal Alberta Museum because finally being marginalized, being abused, being told by anthropologists that her traditions had no value. The very anthropologists who theoretically were studying those traditions, she finally left, and she's working on a PhD because she's decided to fight back.
But I guess my point was, just sort of circling back again, is that it has been Indigenous people. I mean, I think back to the 70s when I was first starting, and we were still being publicly referred to as Indians, and the incredible sacrifice of certain people who have chosen to just dedicate their lives to change and growth. There was a program called Indian Control of Indian Education that we started. The organization that I first worked for started that. And I mean, Indian was what we were known as in the 70s. Now it's an insult. Then it was just the word, right? And but it was us that lobbied that to the federal government to make sure that residential schools would never happen again, and began the whole program of First Nation controlled educational institutions. But we are an injured people, and yet we still have to carry the burden of educating non-Indigenous people. And that's one thing that I say all the time these days, is that the most important thing an ally, a true ally, can do is to take responsibility for their own education and to work at it, and to acknowledge that we are the walking wounded, and we need to be focusing our attention inward. And these hundreds of years where we have worn the mantle, carried the mantle of telling the truth about what Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations are all about. And with people, I believe, starting to open their eyes, and the discovery of these graves is critical, has been a critical part of that. I just keep hoping that maybe the large part of our population, which of course is non-Indigenous, will begin raising their voices meaningfully and contributing their time meaningfully to insist on reconciliation, to insist on justice, and to insist on relationships between Indigenous governments and non-Indigenous governments that respect the intent of those treaty relationships, which was equal nations engaging into agreements about how they would mutually live in this land and benefit from the resources of this land. It was never intended that we would be wards. And so I'm hoping that we're at a period of awakening. I have to hope.
Yes, that's a wonderful hope to close on. I often have this fantasy in my head of what our world would be like if the Europeans had arrived on the American shores and had established embassies instead of colonies. But we can't go back. But
my son used to say we should have killed them all when they hit the beach. And I used to say to him, and it was from his bitterness about this reality that we live. And I used to say to him, but then we wouldn't be who we are. That's not who we are as a people, as peoples. That's not who we are. And so we continue to carry that mantle because of who we are. But I whatever platform I have, I just encourage people to educate yourself. Everything, all the deep research that, I had to do in dusty archives starting in 2000, you can now do online with it. It's so easy to find the truth about all of this now. And I believe that we are, obliged to find that truth and to share it and to create something new.
thank you for that. And I think Maria's appearance means there may be some questions from.
Well, I think, you've already anticipated some of the questions. We do have some Canadians in our audience today, some people who also have ancestors who were survivors of the school. And there were questions about the intergenerational transmission of trauma, which is also something that, we as psychologists and psychoanalysts are very interested in. But you did already touch on that. I don't know if you want to add anything. I know, I think I read that your grandmother was a survivor of the schools.
My mother was a survivor of the schools. And, I believe that my mother chose to marry a non-Indigenous person, partly, she loved my dad, obviously, but partly to make sure that we wouldn't be taken. Because at that time, if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she was no longer legally Indian. And so therefore, the government had no jurisdiction to take the children. It's just about that. But the important thing that I think people need to understand about intergenerational harm is that it works not just in the descendants, but the ancestors experienced it as well. It's not linear, it's circular. And it just, like I say, it's a half-life. And until we can be self-determining and self-sufficient, which requires resource sharing agreements, we will never be able to focus our attention on what we need to focus on, which is healing, which is deep, deep healing.
Mm-hmm. When you spoke about the roles that the parents and grandparents were deprived of, it strikes at the very core of a person's identity and who they are. And I can just, the idea of that pain is just really overwhelming. And the process of healing, I don't know that you ever really let that go.
Well, one thing I used to say to my clients with some regularity, and, I've experienced some of the things that these kids experienced because I was scooped. I was taken into foster care when I was 13 years old, and I'm a survivor of childhood sexual assault. And I am diagnosed with, complex lifelong post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I understand, I understand the depth of the wound. But one of the things that I used to say to my clients is that, some things we never get over. We just learn how to manage them. And that is, I think, true both individually and collectively, both for individual survivors, intergenerational survivors, direct survivors, and our communities, our collective as well. And yeah, it does. And this, what you say, it goes to the core of identity. That's a really excellent way of saying it, because it's true. That was the whole point, was to get at the core of identity and to cut it out, to cut out the heart of our people.
Mhm. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me when you were speaking earlier was the sort of mechanistic logic of the dominant society, that if you kill off the buffalo, if you do certain things, if you send the child to the school, save the child, kill the Indian, save the. I've read that. It is as if by altering the way the motors are arranged, you can build a different machine and expect a uniform outcome. And of course, the human being is not a machine in any way, shape, or form. But the system itself strikes me as such a kind of powerful and horrific embodiment of that kind of thinking that sees the human as simply an instrument in a plan.
Yes, and that's that and I mean it makes me laugh, but sort of in a ironic kind of way, right? Because here was this phenomenal machine that was created right across the continent, really, to to destroy us, right? To get to that core of us and to hopefully, get rid of it. And here we are. We're still standing. We're still standing. And we're not only still standing, look at us. Look at what we've been able to accomplish in spite of this, this all-out effort to destroy us, right? And we're still here, and there are so many communities that suffer deep poverty because of the way we have been controlled. But there are so many communities that have been able to, if they have some source of resources, have been able to just develop wonderful things. We did this. We made sure that our rights were entrenched in the Canadian Constitution. This damaged people that was the target of all of this viciousness, we were still able to rise up and to create a constitutional amendment, for goodness sake. How fabulous are we? How fabulous are Indigenous people that we could be so brutalized and still be so powerful. And that is what I feel I have to say to every Indigenous person, is we are so powerful.
And
resilient, yes.
You also put me deeply in mind. We spoke about this when we talked before, but this experience that I had in Alberta of being a part of a sweat, middle of winter, this extraordinary spiritual journey, and coming back to my then in-laws' house, only probably a half a dozen kilometers away, and telling them about it and seeing their eyes open wide because they had no clue that such a thing was in their midst, and it struck my heart very deeply at that point that everybody gets poorer from this separation, that there is a Euro-Canadian, Euro-North American the community that is utterly blind to the cultural richness that is here and the spiritual richness that's here, that is open in a way.
And another example of the racism, I remember this was in the 70s, and it kind of led up to a big major change in the law. But it was, in the time when basically taking Indigenous kids, when the child welfare system basically picked up the role of the residential schools once they started to slow down. And there was this incident where these children were apprehended from a home in the northeast of British Columbia, and they were taken because they said there was no food in the house. in fact, hanging from the rafters in this house was an entire winter's supply of dried meat. The social worker who apprehended these children, and we got them back, but the social worker that apprehended the children said, I thought they were rags. I thought it was rags. Okay. So when you talk about that ignorance, right, like there's this whole reality, right, and then a cultural divide, and then you have these people that are in a position of power that are clueless, right, that are going around implementing, heinous acts on that's based on ignorance, right? And it just, yeah. So, but we went from that, and it's again about us and how powerful we are. We went from that to, in British Columbia, it was a British Columbia band. Under the Indian Act, we have bylaw making powers. And this First Nation created a child welfare bylaw that has resisted, that has stood the test of time. They still maintain jurisdiction over child welfare. Nobody can go into that community and take kids. And that rose initially from that incident of that apprehension of those children. And so, and I mean, now there are designated, they call them designated authorities or something, where the social services designates their jurisdiction to Indigenous organizations to handle child welfare. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's better than residential schools, right? And again, it's about us just taking this, just doing what we have to do, and just in spite of, against all the odds, out of poverty, out of all of the issues that we have to deal with, we're still making it happen.
I'm sorry to have to interrupt that we've come to the end of our time together here today. But I want to thank you, Michelle, and also to Tom, for the very powerful and moving history and narrative. And I want you to know that we have all been changed by your telling us this history and your narrative today. And I know, at least for me, it has changed me and made a difference, and hopefully I'll be able to pass that on. In doing this series, we have heard over and over from the victims that the burden is on their shoulders, and it can't be anymore. So I really, from the bottom of my heart, want to thank you today for this talk, and to Tom too for your really beautiful moderating. Really appreciate it. I also want to tell the audience that this session is recorded and will be on the Institute's YouTube channel. So if you have friends, family, others that you would like to share it with, if you're teaching in universities, please share it with your students. So we thank you for that. And I also want to alert you to our next event, which will be on a Friday instead of the usual Saturday. It'll be on November 12th at a Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning. And our speaker will be Professor Laura T. Murphy, and she'll be coming to us from the UK. Professor Murphy is Professor of Human Rights and Contemporary Slavery at the Helena Kennedy Center at Sheffield Hallam University. She's the author most recently of Freedomville, the story of a 21st century slave revolt. You may have seen the article about that in the New York Times recently. And she's also the author of The New Slave Narrative, The Battle of Representation of Contemporary Slavery and Survivors of Slavery, Modern Day Slave Narratives. She's consulted to the World Health Organization, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Office of Victims in Crime, and the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. In addition, to her work on bonded labor. She is currently working on addressing forced labor in the Uyghur region of China. So we appreciate your participation today. Michelle, Tom, thank you so much. And we hope to see everyone again in November. So thank you so much.
I would just like to say that if there were any questions that were unanswered, that you can send them to me and I'll answer them, and you can pass it on somehow to the participants. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, and so your email address is available on the internet?
We have it.
We have it.
That's fine. Yeah. Okay. All right, great. All right.
Michelle, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, and thank you. And thank you to all the participants, who are caring enough to participate in these kinds of things, to increase your awareness and your power to change. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.